get us started today. We're going to do a resume workshop, and I'm excited that we have Linda Segal with us today. She's actually one of our Rosslyn companies, McCormick Group. They're an executive search firm, and Linda has been with McCormick Group for almost 23 years. She's got a career, has had a career in marketing and public relations, event planning for organizations, and has really been working in the recruiting space for, as I said, the last 23 years. So Linda, welcome, and I'm thrilled to have you with us today. I know you've got lots of great things that you're going to share with us. So thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope that we answer the questions of those who have signed on to participate, and if not, I hope that they will send us questions while we're going through this so that we can hopefully answer all of those questions today.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so please do, if you have questions, go ahead and chat those to us, and we will also share Linda's email address with you. So if you have questions, she'd be happy to answer those as well. So we're going to go ahead and jump in, and we've got just a little bit of material to present, and it'll kind of be a back and forth dialogue, and then we'll also sprinkle in your questions as well. So I'm gonna kick it back over to you to get us started, Linda.
Okay, when you think about your resume, I will tell you one thing first, which is nobody ever went to school to learn how to write a resume. But at the same time, you're the one who knows you best. You know what you've done. You know the value that you bring to a company, and realize that a resume is meant to start a conversation. It's not meant to be the end all and be all of you. It is really meant to get somebody interested to want to know more. And before we go forward, I want to just get a few housekeeping tips out of the way, because no matter whether you are just starting your career or whether you have been in your career for 30 years, these housekeeping tips go across the board. And the first one is make sure somebody can actually read your resume. It's amazing to me how many people try to get more information on a page than possible, and the font is so small you need a magnifying glass to see what's being said. So you really want a consistent font. You want a font that's large enough to be read, and you want it on a piece of paper where it's not crowded and you can't see what's being written on that piece of paper. You'd be surprised how a resume can change when it's been emailed, because a lot of that depends on the settings of the receiver's computer. So make sure that you start with a font that can be read. Second, make sure they know how to find you. Your name, your phone number, your email address should be in the middle of the first page on the top. I actually got a resume once from a PhD scientist. He actually had sent me a CV, which is different than a resume, but his name and his street address was on the front page, but I had to go looking to page 18 to find a way in which to get in touch with him. I couldn't find an email address. I couldn't find a phone number until the bottom of page 18. Don't make somebody have to hunt in order to get in touch with you, because the probability is they'll move on to the next resume instead. So absolutely make sure that they know how to find you. And the third piece is proofread. Proofread, proofread, proofread. You'd be surprised how spell check, do not just rely on spell check. Spell check will change letters, they will change phrases. Spell check is known for doing that, and if you don't proofread, you stand the probability of winding up in the circular file. The best way to find a typo is to literally read your resume line by line, word by word, out loud. Don't just assume that by reading it silently, you're going to catch something. You usually don't catch it until you've actually had to say the word out loud. And when I talk about spell check making a change and not telling you that there is a problem, in my public relation days, I had to do a writing sample for an employer. And the writing sample actually was a press release talking about the board of directors of a company. And I accidentally put in broad instead of board. And so I was talking about the company broad. Obviously, I gave the hiring authority a laugh, but I didn't get the job. And it just really reinforced in me the fact that you really want to make sure that you don't have any typos.
Yeah, and I would even say, Linda, I think a great thing to do is to have someone else read it. I know when I'm creating a document, I know what I expect to be there. And so sometimes you can actually read what you think is there because you've intended it to be there. So I would second the proofreading, but I would also have someone else read it for you, both for typos, but then also content. So there may be things that you're putting in there that they don't understand what it means. And so that can just be a great way to sort of check yourself and check what you're doing, because you know what you're intending, but the audience may not.
Good point. And I would definitely second that suggestion. It definitely is a good suggestion. Also, when you get to your resume, to break up the different sections of the resume, you might want to use a slightly larger font for those sections, the section heads. It's not absolutely necessary, but it certainly will point an employer in the vein of, okay, this is a different section. I should be reading this for different content.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Linda. I will tell you, whenever we're doing a job search, what ends up happening, we use recruiters, and so the recruiters will help us sort of filter things out. And then once we get to it, a lot of times what we're doing is we're having conversations and we're going back and forth between maybe a pool. Let's say we've kind of narrowed it down to the 3 or 4 candidates that we want to interview on the phone and then that we want to bring in. And I will tell you, when you're seeing that many candidates, you forget which one was it that had that piece. And so by actually having those sections that Linda's talking about, where you're really delineating by using a stylized font or a bold header, it actually helps the hiring manager kind of breeze through it. And then when you're comparing, it just makes it as easy as you can make it on them is what you want to do.
Absolutely. Okay, so my recommendation is that you start your resume underneath your personal information of name, email address, and phone number. Start with selected achievements, not everything, but just 1, 2, 3, basically 2 or 3 selected achievements that you want to push forward. I recommend not using an objective. Many people use an objective on their resume, but you run the risk if your objective does not match the employer's objective, you're going to be basically weeded out very quickly. Save the objective for a cover letter. At that point, you can spell out in a lot easier, in a paragraph, what you should be focusing on in terms of your objective. A resume should not be paragraphs of prose, because paragraphs of prose are very difficult to scan quickly. and a resume will get scanned in less than 20 seconds. And I have heard it being scanned in sometimes as short as 7 seconds. And if they can't grab the information from your resume, you're not going to get the focus that you want. So use bullet points, and those bullet points should be short, they should be succinct, they don't have to be full sentences. Phrases work, and that's what you should be considering in terms of your whole resume. So on your selected achievements, you want to talk about what did you actually accomplish in your career so far, and why did those accomplishments matter to the company that you were working for. Usually when I say why did they matter, there's usually a financial benefit that relates to where your value is. Financial benefit could be that you made money for the company, you saved them money, you made them more efficient, which therefore makes them save money. You may have put a project further along on its path. You may have done that under budget. You may have done that in less time than was expected. All of that relates to the bottom line of a company. And that's what you want to get forward. A resume is not meant to tout what you personally have learned. It is meant to tout, what do you bring to the table? Why should somebody want to hire you? What can you do for them that goes further in terms of moving the company to where it wants to be?
Linda, on the selected achievements section, what is your recommendation? Because by the way, I agree. I actually like to see, because these are those high level things. I mean, because you're going to have obviously your employment section, which we're going to get to next. But when we're talking about selected achievements, what do you recommend in terms of, as you're selecting 2 or 3 of these? I always look at that as sort of telling a narrative about yourself, and really sort of coming across sort of what you're bringing to the table. So do you have suggestions for sort of how you orient those accomplishments? Because, you know, maybe one accomplishment was at your most recent job and another accomplishment was earlier in your career. So is there a specific way that you like to have candidates kind of lay that out?
There's an exercise that I was going to discuss towards the end of our presentation that will get to your favorite accomplishments and the ones that will highlight what you bring to the table. You highlight your skills, highlight your talents.
Why don't we do that now? You know, because I think this makes
Sure.
sense, because I do think the model that you're going to be looking for, or that you're going to be talking about right here, I think this belongs up there. So let's go ahead and address it now.
Okay, we can do that. So this is a computer document that you should be creating, and it is something that you can add to. It is something that you can subtract to. I have achievements listed on my document that go back 30 years. And so it is a help for me to realize what is it that I have really enjoyed doing in my career. So it's what we call the STAR exercise. S is for the situation. What was the situation when you started doing a project? What was it that you needed to focus on? The T is for the task or the action. What was the action in the task that you had to actually do? The A is for your achievement, your accomplishment. What did you actually get accomplished? And then the result is the R, or the impact. So what you're looking at is that result is, how did it affect the company? How did it affect the organization that you were working for? I am not interested in learning that this was the best way for you to learn X, Y, and Z, but rather, what did you bring into the company? Now, this exercise is going to do a couple of things for you. First of all, it's going to show you what your sweet spot is. What do you really like doing? What's the trend? Because believe me, you're not going to say, look at me. You're not going to beat your chest and say, hey, look at what I've done, when it's something that you hated doing. You may have done it very well, but you never want to do it again. And so you're not going to put it on this list. So you're going to see, where do you get enjoyment out of your job? Second, it's going to make writing your resume a lot easier, because the A and the R becomes the bullet point on your resume for your different jobs and under your different employers. Third, it's going to remind you of the value that you bring to the table. It's going to remind you of why somebody should want to talk with you.
Yeah, and I think that is so important, Linda, is to really talk in results. I will share, that was something that I struggled with earlier in my career, of figuring out how to really get down. And one of the things that I recommend to do is the 5 whys. So if you ask yourself 5 times, why is that important, or why should someone care about that, you're going to keep drilling deeper and deeper. And then usually before the 5th, but at least by the 5th time, you're going to get down to the baseline result. And I think that's so important to be able to speak. You know, you want to talk about the situation, you know, was it unusual, unique? For example, when I was in television and we were doing the transition to digital, we were going from analog to digital. This was an industry changing moment. It was a very important moment. And I had a senior level position. And I remember and it wasn't on my resume, but I actually used the STAR model. I was doing an application for the Women Who Mean Business Award. And they gave the advice, you really need to talk about your accomplishments from a perspective of what was the impact, what was the result.
Right.
And I used the STAR model to force myself to think about, okay, yeah, I managed the digital transition for the television station. Well, that's nice, but someone who's outside of the industry doesn't realize like how impactful that was. So I was able to then go back and talk about the fact that this was industry changing, and that this was no small feat to get 7 of our stations to move to a digital platform. And then I talked about the result, both in terms of dollars of the project, and then the resulting impact and the savings that we had from an operational perspective. So I think this is a great method. It's also a great method to prepare for an interview, because you want to be able to talk.
I was just about to say that the last value that I find from this exercise is that you have something that you can review the night before any meeting or any interview, and therefore something that you may have done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, becomes uppermost in your mind. So when you're sitting in that meeting or that interview and a question is asked and this is the perfect answer, it's going to trip off your tongue very smoothly. You're not going to be going, what was that thing that I did? Because I need all of that information. You will have just reviewed it. So it's one of the reasons why I say it should be a computer document that you can add and subtract from, so that you have it throughout your career as you go forward. So
that's the selected achievements section of the resume. And
right,
now
we're going to now go into the employment history.
Great.
You want to list your employer, your titles, and the years you were employed in that organization. And don't just use your last title. If you were in an organization and had more than one position, make sure you put that on your resume. It shows that the company valued you. It shows that the company either promoted you or moved you around within the company because your expertise, your knowledge, your skills were needed in a different area. And therefore, they wanted to take advantage of the fact that you were working for them. You don't want to see vice president and all of the years that you've been at the company, when in fact you may have started as an assistant, a manager, a director, a senior director, then vice president. I would, just in terms of format, I would have your employer on the left side of the resume, start the sentence on the left side of the resume, and on the same line, all the way on the right, have your total years of experience, and then indent the rest of it. Indent the different titles and the years or the months that you were at the different titles. And hopefully you're going to be able to tell me or tell the employer, the hiring authority, something that you were doing for each of those jobs. Remember, if you went through a series of titles, your employer valued the fact that you were working for them.
Yeah, and I think that's really important in two scenarios. I mean, I think everyone needs to include this on a resume, but there's two situations I think that this is really important. Number one, for those that are just starting out in their career, maybe they started out as an intern, or they may have had different project. Like, so for example, they may have been over here under this department, but they actually got an opportunity to work on another project over here. That can be another great way to maybe fill out the resume if you don't have years and years of experience and it's feeling like the page isn't all that long. That's another great way to point to special projects or other things that you were asked to do that may have been outside of that main area of responsibility.
And for those of you who are just starting on your career, don't forget what you may have done during your school years. You may have run an event. You may have been the head of your team. You may have done something else. You may have been on the newspaper, and not as a reporter, but maybe as the head of the financial department for the school. All of it gets filtered and put into a resume so that you are not just looking at where were you paid in the regular world of employment. Don't forget what else you may have done. But once you have your employer listed, your titles, your years that you were there, describe your responsibilities. Use a short sentence or maximum 2 sentences to talk about what you were hired to do. What were your responsibilities? Then highlight the other achievements and accomplishments that you've done in that job. There's a big difference between responsibilities and accomplishments.
Yeah, and that kind of goes towards what I was saying earlier about like the special projects. You know, the responsibilities are sort of the day-to-day duties that you had and that were under your purview, whereas the accomplishments were, again, what you achieved and what that meant to the company. But again, that's within that employment history can be a great place to include, I think, some of those special projects or other things that you were doing. The other thing I would say here too, you know, Linda, you were talking earlier about when you're selecting the accomplishments, you want to pick things that you really enjoyed doing because you're highlighting and you're creating a narrative about yourself. This becomes really also important, I think, for career changers. So if you are moving careers, you can use this employment history section to think about how might you highlight skill sets and accomplishments that can actually be transferable. So although it still may be a chronological or a functional resume where you're talking about the employment history that you had, there's a way to kind of present that information that really is more of a skills-based formatting. And what that does in particular for someone who is changing careers or changing industries is it allows you to highlight the skills that you think will be required for the new job.
Correct. Absolutely. I agree with you on that one. In addition, once you go through your working history, then you put your educational institutions, your degrees, include your relevant extracurriculars activity, because that is important. It basically rounds you out as a person, but make sure it's relevant. And then any special training that you have. There are people, for instance, who do regulatory affairs in the pharmaceutical area, and they may have some training through the regulatory affairs professional society, and employers will be looking for those. You also want to add at that point any specific skills and talents that you have, just bullet point them, so that you are adding the key words that are critical if it's a computer, unfortunately, that is doing the scanning of your resume and not a person. So you want to make sure that somewhere on the resume you have those skills listed, and therefore you can in fact get through that screening.
Yeah, I think, and that's, Linda, in particular, when you are in specific industries, government contracting often is one, very technical fields that require those degrees, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I know when I was a consultant, one of our clients was the FAA, and we were working with the procurement office that was actually the one that was filtering all of the resumes. Right. And it was a very kind of straightforward process. If they did not see those, if the requirements were X number of years, certain degree, or training, if that was not listed on the resume, out it went. And they could have, maybe they just left it off and they were perfect in every other way. But so I think it's a great point. It's being creative about how you use each of these sections in the resume. Because more and more so today, AI computer programs are in some respects helping hiring managers to cull the resumes, and in particular in a government situation or in a very technical field where there are very strict and strident requirements that are mandated by the contract. So that is important, and that's a great way to kind of sneak those in if they didn't really fit in the upper portions of the resume neatly.
Exactly. Speaking engagements, publications, civic activities, board memberships, all of that is important, but you don't want it to take up a large amount of space on your resume. Consider if you're a PhD and you've had a number of publications, or you've had a number of speaking engagements, consider putting those on an addendum that can be attached to your resume. Because if you're early in your career, a resume should be no more than about a page. If you are further along in your career, 2 to 3 pages is considered fine, but you don't want to wind up having somebody slog through 5, 7, 10 pages just to find the information that they want to find out. Can you do the job that they need you to do? Definitely you want to keep it short and sweet, because as I said, this is not meant to be all about everything there is to know about you. It is meant to entice somebody to call you to say, I want to know more. I want to either embellish on some activity or achievement that you've had, or I want to know more about a specific employer that you've worked for. You want to be able to just entice them to give you a call.
Yep. So we did the STAR method. Other tips, Linda. So I think, we've kind of walked through kind of the broad brush strokes of how the resume is laid out, some do's and don'ts in terms of, proofreading and all of those types of things. Are there other kind of expert tips that you have? So like you're a recruiter, you see presumably hundreds of resumes, in a week, depending on where you are in any particular job search. What are the things that stand out to you, Linda, when you're looking through a file of resumes, either visually or layout wise? Like what are the things that really stand out to you and that you notice when a resume catches your eye?
A resume will catch my eye if someone has been in the job that I am trying to fill, or is just below that job, and this would be a step up for them. A resume will catch my eye, actually a cover letter will catch my eye if someone literally spells out where the connection is between what they have done and what I am looking for. We don't post our jobs, we don't advertise, and so therefore I need to find folks who I know can do the job that we are trying to fill. But I don't want to have to be hunting for information. I don't want to be trying to hunt for a connection between where you've been and who my client is. So if I'm looking, for instance, for somebody who has been in the drug development world, and you're talking to me about some software, but there is nothing in your resume that links you to drug development, you're probably not going to move to the next phase of the search.
Yeah. And sorry, I'm figuring out how to do my screen share. I think I stopped it correctly. We do have a couple questions from some of our attendees, so I'm gonna throw those out there. So Antoinette is asking, you mentioned keeping the objectives to keep objectives for the cover letter. What about a short description of your skills at the top of the resume? What do you think about that? How does that read to an employer when you sort of put those at the top? She said she's heard sometimes it's good if companies are using tools that search for keywords. We talked a little bit about that. And then that way it kind of picks those up sort of right at the beginning. So what are your thoughts about that?
If you're early in your career, that's probably where you should put it. But it wouldn't hurt to put it at the end, because AI will in fact go through the entire resume. So I wouldn't worry as much about that. What I would worry about is using words that are objective instead of subjective, or rather, right, because subjective words basically are dependent on who's defining them. Perfect example is I often get from somebody in their cover letter or in their email or even on their resume, an energetic executive. Well, energetic depends on who's defining it.
Yeah.
If you walk around the block or run around the block, you may think that you're energetic, but somebody else might run 3 miles a day and run a marathon once a month. And I would say that that would be extremely energetic, but you want to be careful about whose definition does that word need. But if you're telling me that you are a software developer, well, that's not something that's open to question. If you're telling me that you are a financial auditor, that's not open to question. People who are in those industries have specific expectations of people who have those talents and skills. So be careful with the words that you use to describe yourself. If you can say whose definition, then you might want to find a different word or leave it off completely.
Okay, great. Another question that we have from Justin. I struggle with how many hard data points or numbers to add to my resume. Right now, I try to highlight one key piece of data per job. Should I be doing more, or should I save these data points for a cover letter? He wants to make sure that it's digestible.
Justin, there is no limit to how many numbers you can put on a resume, because I will tell you that numbers stand out amongst the pros. And if you've got selected accomplishments, if you've got accomplishments and achievements at all of your employers, and you can document that you brought in twice the money in 1 year over the last year, if you doubled the time in which you shaved from a project, absolutely add it.
Okay.
There's no limit, I don't think, to how many numbers you got in there. Just make sure that the numbers are right.
Yeah, make sure they're correct. And also the other thing too is knowing how you calculated them, because there are some things that are very hard and fast. So for example, a social media manager, they can talk about how they brought, the Facebook likes from, 50 to 350 or whatever the percentage are, but there are some other things that are maybe a little softer. And so it's thinking about how you can create data when data maybe doesn't necessarily exist. And so that's another sort of thing to think through. And that's where I've always relied on other people to help me think that through. Like even now when I'm talking about certain things that are a little more tough to quantify with my board, I'm typically working with my vice president of finance to help me think about a creative way that we can create a metric for that if it's not something that's like a hard and fast kind of a role. So we have another question from Wayne. He is asking, should we use a professional resume service? Are they worth it?
Personally, I happen to believe that you know yourself best and you know what you bring to the table. I will also say that not everyone is a writer, and you still want to present yourself in the best light. I wouldn't go and spend a lot of money on a resume writing service, but if you can find someone who can help you with your resume, just be careful that it doesn't look packaged and more like a brochure. I can tell automatically when I get a resume whether or not it came from a resume service.
Interesting. That's because I from the hiring side of the equation, I don't know, like I feel like when I look at something that's sort of packaged like that, to me, I'm sort of like, oh wow, that looks really good and clean. So I guess, but that's really interesting because the recruiter, remember there are at least two entities that could be involved in a hiring process. You have the recruiter who is helping to screen and helping to find the right candidates to present to the hiring manager. And then of course there's the hiring manager. And in our organization, we actually go with a full team. So we do sort of a 360 hiring where, although the ultimate decision is mine, I rely very heavily on the team's input, and they're looking at the resumes as well. And so, for example, if we're making a hire in the marketing department, the marketing manager is going to be the first brush of looking through those resumes. And just remember that not everyone has the same experience level of looking at a resume and maybe being able to kind of dive into some of those points as maybe a recruiter does. So that's the other reason that I do think it's really important to use that STAR model to really highlight out those accomplishments so that anyone can understand very clearly and quickly kind of like what you're trying to get across.
And I would also say that if you're in the marketing world, realize that you are now selling yourself. and look at your resume as you are the product. How would I sell? How would I market this product? Those in the marketing departments will look at a resume and say, if you can't sell me on calling you because of your resume, then how are you going to be able to market my product?
I think that is 100% spot on. If you're an engineer, your resume probably has to be, or if you're in finance, it probably has to be very accurate, very clean, very data driven. If you're looking for a marketing role or a social media role, it needs to have some flair and some creativity. You need to match the job that you're going to, because this is your first ability to demonstrate your skill set of what you're doing. And if your resume is kind of boring and it doesn't come across as able to sell yourself, as Linda said, I think that's a great point.
And it depends on which way you're going and who you're addressing. Because, for instance, if you remember the Reese Witherspoon movie where she was in law school, and she had a resume that was on pink paper that was scented. That wouldn't go over with a whole lot of employers.
But it might with the right one.
I was going to say, but with you are in fact looking at sort of off the chart, off the grid kind of social media company or marketing company, it might be the perfect way to get a reaction on your resume.
No, I think that's spot on. This is a great question from Chris, and this really gets to sort of that transition of skills and how to make yourself marketable in a different industry. So Chris says he's a military officer that's about to retire. My last position in the military was an IT program manager, and he served on the acquisition side of the Army for 10 plus years. The first 10 years prior to the acquisition side was the operational combat side of the Army. So how does Chris make both sides of the military career attractive to employers that might not be familiar with the operational side as they would with the IT program manager or government contracting side? And I think that's such a great question, because this actually applies to even other industries, right? Where people may not really be familiar with what happens in a very technical field. So what do you think?
Okay, first off, I think Chris needs to figure out what Chris wants to do. And which area does he want to focus on? And there's an exercise for that as well. And that is, take 3 pieces of paper, take a bunch of index cards. On the first piece of paper, you write satisfiers. On the second piece of paper, you write dissatisfiers. Free associate and think about everything you've either liked or disliked about a job and put it on the correct piece of paper. Once you finish free associating on that score, look at the third piece of paper and you write wish list. What are the things that you still haven't done that you'd like to do? Once you have finished with everything that you can imagine, then take your 3x5 cards, your index cards, and write 1 item per card, and obviously coming from these 3 lists. So if one list has 10 items on it and one list has 7 items and the third list has 5, you should have 22 cards.
Wow.
So each card has only 1 item on it. And now prioritize those cards. And the most important pieces are at the top of the pile. The least important pieces are at the bottom of the pile. And in an ideal world, this is your perfect job. So how much of this list do you absolutely need? Because there is no such thing as ideal and perfect. Therefore, if what you need is the top 15% of this pile, then you can negotiate away the rest of it. And then you know where you need to highlight on your resume to make sure you're focused on that top part of the job. Chris wasn't doing both jobs at the same time. So what Chris needs to do is think about each of those positions and what does he want to highlight, what does he want to spotlight from each position, and think about the accomplishments that fit from in those positions that he had. Career changers who we can very rarely help, also need to do that. You have to think about what it is that you want to be doing and what kind of an industry do you want to be doing it. And the reason I say that we can't usually help them is because our clients usually call us and say, hey, we need an X. And they need somebody who can start and hit the ground running without a very long learning curve. And career.
That's where I think, you know, but to your point about like sort of who can help those career changers, that's where I think getting really clear about what you want to do and what the skills are that you're bringing to the table, and then talking to other hiring managers, even if they're not hiring you, just talking to people who, you know, I mean, I'm a hiring manager. I do this in a lot of different fields, and so getting, I think, a collective of advice is really smart to do.
It's why you network. It's why you go and talk to people, even if they can't help you in terms of offering you a job. It is a chance for them to give you advice on how you can find your job.
Yeah. So we have a good question from Jake. It's actually a two-parter. So should the format of the resume change depending on the job industry? And I know you and I talked a little bit about this, Linda, as we were teeing up this conversation. And I think there's a couple of schools of thought on that. And then finally, do you recommend going with a standard template or trying something out of the box? And I think we talked a little bit about that second part about kind of tailoring the format of it, but I'll put that over to you, Linda. So do you think the format of the resume should change based on industry?
No, I don't. I think that the format is so that it's clearly written and it is highlighting the information. Now, the information may change, but I don't think that the format necessarily should change.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to this, and this was the conversation Linda and I were having earlier, I actually appreciate it when it's, and sometimes it's more obvious than other times, but when someone has really adapted the resume to the job description and they're actually perhaps using some of the same keywords of what we were looking for. So, and I don't know if that's, I think maybe I'm interpreting that differently, because the formatting is, you know, sort of the physical pieces of what we were talking about. So I would agree with Linda that those are still the same key elements that you want to have on the resume. So I think where you're adapting it is more so in the content and how you're bringing out the skill sets is sort of what I would say.
Exactly.
We have another question from Pia. How does volunteer experience compare to a paid experience for a recruiter? So for example, if she's managed people as a volunteer but not professionally, does that appear to be a misrepresentation or a transferable skill?
I would think that's a transferable skill.
I do too.
It depends on what you're talking about. If you have been volunteering and you have been organizing large teams to go out and do some wonderful things, absolutely tout that in your resume and put that under volunteer activities, or even put that under your selected accomplishments up on top. Just make it very clear that this was done for a nonprofit organization on your time, because I think that volunteer work is very important. I have been doing volunteer work basically all of my life. I remember collecting for the March of Dimes through my mother, who was a volunteer for them way back when. And it has helped me, and I continue to volunteer today. So definitely look at your entire life, not just your working life when it comes to writing your resume.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add to that, I actually teach a course on networking. Those that know me know I love networking. It's something that I enjoy doing, and I love sort of teaching on that. And same thing that Linda just said is something that I do think is pretty important around the networking piece of it as well. And that's even just through those conversations, there are so many different, I mean, we tend to think about just what we've done professionally as to putting that on the resume or talking about it in the interview. But those of you who are serving at your church, or your kids, you know, you've organized your kids' soccer team or those types of things. Again, I wouldn't put those above professional experience, but I think these are all important skills that you bring to the table. And it's just a matter of figuring out sort of when you fit those in. And perhaps maybe they don't necessarily go on the resume unless you're looking to build it out further, but they're clearly things that can come up, I think, in the conversation. So we just have time for a couple more questions. We actually have one from Brooke. What are some of the pros and cons of creating a CV versus a resume? So Linda, do you want to talk about the two different formats? Because I've always been sort of confused about the difference between those two as well.
A CV is actually something that is more academic and more scientific. Those who have a PhD will often produce a CV, and it's very odd because it does not really give a lot of information. It will give you employers and titles and dates. It will give you lots of publications and lots of speaking engagements and your educational background. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't really focus on what you've accomplished. And it doesn't focus on what the takeaways are. It is meant for those academic institutions that require publish or perish kind of situations, or did you go through a series of positions to get to the one that you're in. It also includes a lot more personal information than what should be in a resume. When I say personal information, it will talk about date of birth, it will talk about marital status and whether or not you have kids. At one point in time, it used to include someone's social security number.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
So that seems like a bad idea.
Exactly. But then again, when I went to college, my social security number was my student ID. Those were the days when nobody thought that somebody taking your identity through your social security number was a thing. But I would definitely, I would opt for the resume over the CV. If you need to show your speaking engagements, if you need to show your publications, put them in an addendum, because those can sometimes be pages long.
Yeah, great advice. So one final question from Brooke. Aside from obvious spelling errors, are there any obvious red flags to avoid when building your resume that might immediately disqualify you in the eyes of the recruiter? And obviously, Linda, I think we addressed some of those up front, and they seem so super obvious, you know, about the proofreading and actually including your name. I thought that was so funny when I saw that, that someone would actually forget to put their name and number on it, but it happens.
Right.
So anyway, are there any other red flags that you can tell our crew about that they should be on the lookout for?
A red flag would be in applying for a job in which there is no connection to your background. And I've had that happen, where just because you had a title, and you were at a company, but you had no connection to the industry that I'm doing a search in, no connection to the type of job that I am looking to fill. Some people have decided, well, I had the title, but the title in one industry does not mean the same in another. And one of the things that you want to make sure is that you know what you're applying for. For instance, in the life science world, if somebody is looking to be a business developer, right off the top, I can think of 5 very different definitions of a business developer. There is somebody who's doing direct sales. There is somebody who's doing corporate development. There's somebody who's doing mergers and acquisitions, someone who's doing licensing in of technology, and someone who's doing licensing out of technology. 5 very, very different jobs, but they all fall under the banner of business developer.
So that's to your earlier point then, Linda, I think about really qualifying what you're saying instead of just using a term that can be misrepresented. So I think that's a great point.
Let me know what you've done in business development. Don't just say, well, I'm a business developer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Linda, thank you so much for your time today. This was great. I think I actually got a couple tips for my own resume building. And it is one of those things that whether or not you're ready to go looking, I always think it's a good idea to keep these documents up to date and periodically ask yourself within your career, am I on the right track? Am I doing things that bring me joy? Am I able to really offer a good value to the company that I'm working with? And what is my next move? Because the next move may not be out of that company, but it may be, you know, either up the ladder in the company, it may be in a different department within the company. So I think these are great tips to just keep the resume sort of polished up and always be thinking about what you're bringing, the value that you're offering, and what else. I loved what you said, Linda, about with the 3 cards, your wish list. So what do you want in your career and what are you looking for? Because if you have those conversations, it might actually lead you to a new path that maybe you didn't think about, which is always a good thing to do. So thank you. This was our first, actually our second installation of the Rosslyn Roundtable. We'll probably do another one on networking, but certainly we appreciate you all sharing with us whatever you're looking, and we'll find Rosslyn experts and like Linda to bring those to you.
Well, it's been fun, and I hope I was able to answer some questions and get everybody started on taking a look at their resume and with a different eye.
Great. Well, thank you everyone who joined us. Really appreciate it. We'll have to do these next ones as actually a Zoom meeting so we can say hi to you and meet you. And but feel free to reach out to us if we can answer any other questions, or if there are other things that you'd like to see us do, we'd be happy to do those. So thank you, Linda, and thank you everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.